To support her son, single mother agrees to Bathe Millionaire, and the unexpected happens. Before watching the video, please leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. There was a time when Grace Holloway believed she could handle anything life threw at her. But those days felt like a distant memory now, faded like the frayed edges of the baby blanket she still kept folded at the end of her son's bed. At 24, she had weathered more storms than most people face in a lifetime. And yet, as she stood in her tiny kitchen staring at an empty cupboard and an overdue electricity bill pinned to the fridge with a broken magnet, Grace felt the quiet whisper of defeat curl around her. Outside, the city kept moving. It always did. Horns honked, neighbors rushed off to work, and kids laughed on their way to school. But inside that dim apartment, tucked behind a laundromat on the edge of town, the world had stopped. Her 6-year-old son, Aiden, was still sleeping, curled up beneath his worn dinosaur blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of innocence. Grace envied that peace. He didn't know about the final notice on their rent. He didn't hear the landlord's threats. He didn't see the way her hands trembled each morning as she counted coins in her purse and tried to make miracles from nothing. She had tried everything: cleaning drawer, grocery store shifts, online applications that vanished into the digital void. But nothing stuck. Nothing paid enough. The world, it seemed, had no place for a young mother with calloused hands, an unfinished education, and a heart that refused to quit. That morning, as Grace sat at the wobbly kitchen table with a cup of hot water pretending to be tea, she noticed something unusual: a folded flyer, half tucked beneath yesterday's mail. She almost tossed it away, but something made her pause. In neat, typewritten letters, it read, "Private caregiver needed. Live-in position. Discreet, dependable, compassionate, must be committed. Excellent salary, high-profile client, no company logo, no flashy promises." Just a simple phone number and a note that interviews would be held in person. No online applications. Grace read it again and again. Her heart thumped in her chest, slow and heavy, as if warning her to tread carefully. High profile? Live-in? The words felt foreign in her world of hand-me-downs and government assistance. Who would even consider someone like her? But then her eyes drifted to the refrigerator, the past due notice, Aiden's lunchbox, now mostly empty. The drawing he made of a big house with flowers and space to run. Grace felt something in her break open. Not with despair, but with the raw need to hope one more time. If not for herself, then for the boy who had never once asked why Christmas was always quieter at their house, why birthdays came with one cupcake instead of a party. He just smiled. He just loved her. She took the flyer in her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the number again, then scribbled it down on the back of an old envelope. Her reflection in the toaster caught her off guard. Tired eyes, hair pulled back in a rush, a face too young to look so old. But somewhere inside that reflection, there was still a flicker of fight. The next day, she left Aiden with their kind neighbor, Miss Ruth, and took 2 buses and a long walk through a part of the city she'd only seen in magazines. Tall hedges, gated driveways, houses that looked more like museums than homes. She arrived outside a towering iron gate and pressed the intercom with a shaky hand. "Name?" a voice asked. "Grace Holloway. I'm here for the caregiver interview." The gate opened with a slow, almost reluctant groan. The estate beyond it looked like something from another life. Gardens sculpted with impossible precision. A mansion with white pillars and tall windows. Everything quiet and still, like a dream paused in time. Grace walked the stone path, her breath catching in her throat, her heart thundering with every step. A woman in a crisp uniform met her at the door. "I'm Carla, the house manager. Please follow me." Grace nodded, too nervous to speak. The halls were lined with art, marble floors muffled their steps, and chandeliers glowed softly above them. It felt like walking through someone else's life. "You'll be meeting Mr. Damian Whitmore," Carla explained as they reached a large office door. "He's direct. Just be honest." Grace swallowed hard. Honest. She could do that. That's all she had, really. When the door opened, she saw him, a man seated in a sleek wheelchair, sharply dressed despite the early hour. His face was handsome but hardened, his jaw set in quiet authority, his eyes distant, guarded, cold. "You're the applicant?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, sir. I'm Grace Holloway." Damien's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't look like a professional caregiver." "I'm not," she admitted, "but I am a fast learner. I work hard, and I need this job." "Why?" Grace didn't flinch. "Because I have a son. He's 6. He deserves more than I can give him right now. And I'll do whatever it takes to change that." There was a long pause. Damien leaned back, his gaze heavy, unreadable. "Start tomorrow. Be on time. And don't make me regret this." As Grace walked out of that office, her legs felt weak, not from fear, but from something more dangerous. Hope. The job came with uncertainty, with challenges she couldn't yet name, but also with a salary that could change everything. That night, as she lay beside Aiden in their little apartment, she whispered a silent promise into the darkness. "No matter what waits behind that mansion's doors, I will not fail you." And somewhere in the distance, life began to turn again. The following morning, Grace stood at the threshold of a world that didn't feel like it belonged to her. As the towering iron gate creaked open, revealing a long, winding path flanked by hedges, clipped to perfection, and roses arranged like they'd been handpicked by angels themselves, she couldn't help but feel like she'd stumbled into someone else's dream. The mansion loomed ahead, elegant, intimidating, the kind of home that looked like it had never known hunger or heartbreak. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her thrift store purse as she walked forward, the gravel crunching beneath her worn-out flats. Each step echoed louder than the last, as if the ground itself were warning her, "Be careful what you're walking into." She had no idea then that this house would witness her most difficult moments and her most miraculous ones. The front door opened before she could knock. A tall woman in her late 50s, dressed in a navy uniform crisp enough to cut glass, stood in the doorway. "You must be Grace. I'm Carla. Follow me." No warm welcome, no small talk. Just brisk steps and walls that smelled faintly of polished wood and secrets. Grace followed Carla through high-ceilinged halls filled with oil paintings and silence so heavy it seemed to settle on her shoulders like a second coat. The kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful, it felt watched. "He's in the study," Carla said, stopping in front of a wide double door. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't like pleasantries. Be honest. Be brief." Grace barely had time to nod before Carla pushed the door open. There behind a wide desk sat Damien Whitmore. The name on the flyer hadn't mentioned it, but Grace recognized him the moment she saw him. Not because of fame, but because of presence. A man who didn't have to raise his voice to command a room. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his shirt collar stiff, and though he sat in a sleek wheelchair, it did nothing to soften the steel in his demeanor. His eyes were sharp, gray and piercing, like winter that had learned to speak. He looked at her for a full 5 seconds before speaking. "You're the applicant?" Grace swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, sir. Grace Holloway." His gaze moved from her face to her clothes, her hands, her shoes, judging every inch of her without apology. "You've never worked as a caregiver before?" "No, sir, but I've been one every day for the last 6 years." That made his eyebrow twitch. Barely, but it was something. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Why are you here?" Grace's voice was steady, even as her stomach twisted. "Because my son deserves a future, and I'll do whatever I have to give it to him." A silence stretched between them, thick and strange. She felt the weight of it in her bones. Finally, Damien said, "Start tomorrow, 7 a.m. Be punctual, and don't expect to be thanked." That was it. No tour, no contract, just orders and an unspoken challenge in his gaze. "Let's see how long you last." Grace nodded, her heartbeat thundering beneath her ribs. "Yes, sir." And just like that, she was in. But from the moment she returned the next morning, dressed in her neatest clothes and heart braced for whatever lay ahead, Grace began to understand that this house wasn't just large, it was lonely. It had the quiet of a place long abandoned by joy. The paintings watched, the chandeliers whispered, the shadows held stories they didn't want to tell. Carla met her in the kitchen, already prepping tea with military precision. "He's not kind," she said plainly, handing Grace a tray with his medication. "But he's broken. The difference matters. Don't confuse the two." Grace nodded, her hands trembling only slightly as she accepted the tray. Thank you. As they walked the long corridor to Damien's wing of the house, Carla explained the routine. Precise times for everything. Breakfast at 8, bathing at 9, physical therapy exercises at 10. No unnecessary conversation. No questions. He doesn't tolerate sympathy, Carla warned, but he notices everything. The first time Grace entered the master bath to assist him, she found it immaculately arranged. Assistive railings on every wall, a shower bench crafted from something that looked more like art than medical equipment, and expensive soaps lined up like soldiers. She was still scanning the room when she heard the soft hum of wheels against tile. Damien entered, maneuvering his chair with practiced ease, and without even looking at her, he said, "Let's get this over with. I don't have all day." She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." As she helped him transfer to the bench, her fingers brushed against the scars on his arms, long, jagged, healed over with the kind of silence only years of shame could create. She didn't ask, she didn't flinch. She simply steadied him and did her job, the way a soldier carries out orders on the battlefield. But he noticed. She could feel it in the way he watched her, not openly, but through the corner of his eye, measuring her, waiting for her to judge him, or pity him, or fail. "I'm not an invalid," he said suddenly, voice sharp as a blade. "I know," she replied softly. "You're a man who wants his independence. I respect that." Another long silence, then, "Humph, that was all." But something shifted. Over the next few days, Grace learned how to read the unspoken language of the mansion. The way Carla's footsteps slowed outside certain rooms, the way Damien's hands trembled slightly when talk of the past hovered near, the way the hall lights flickered just before a storm. She learned that while Damien never asked for company, he often lingered in rooms just long enough to hear her footsteps pass by, as if ensuring he was still seen. On the fifth day, something unexpected happened. She heard a small knock on the front door, rapid and uneven. When she opened it, her heart dropped. Aiden. He'd run all the way from Miss Ruth's, shoes muddy, hands clutching a wrinkled drawing of Mommy in a big castle house. Before Grace could scold him or pull him into her arms, a voice spoke from behind. "What's going on?" Damien. He was in the hallway, eyes narrowed, looking between the child and Grace with unreadable expression. Aiden stepped forward without fear, holding out the drawing like it was a peace offering. "Are you the man in the chair?" Damien blinked. "I am. This is for you. My mommy says you're a grumpy, but not mean." Grace felt her soul leave her body. Damien took the paper, studied it, said nothing. But later that night, Grace found the drawing carefully folded on his nightstand, not thrown away. The house was changing, subtly. Damien began letting her help more, began asking questions. Not many, and never personal, but still. He listened. He saw her. One evening, as she handed him his medication, he said something that stopped her breath. "You remind me of someone I knew before all this." "Was she kind?" Grace asked. "No," he said. "She was strong." From him, that was a declaration. But just as things began to warm, a cold wind blew in. Evelyn, Damien's longtime business associate, or so she claimed, appeared one morning in heels sharp enough to cut diamonds, and a voice dipped in disdain. "You're the new caretaker," she said to Grace with a saccharine smile. "How quaint." Her presence darkened the halls. Damien's shoulders stiffened when she entered the room. Conversations grew clipped, and the walls, once merely silent, now seemed to whisper warnings. "You don't belong here," Evelyn told Grace one evening in the kitchen. "And people who overstay their welcome often find themselves pushed out." But Grace wasn't the same woman who stared at empty cupboards and cried in silence. She met Evelyn's gaze and replied, "I'm not here for you, and I won't be leaving unless he asks me to." Because somewhere between medication schedules and shared silences, between the trembling hands and the folded drawings, Grace began to see Damien not just as a man in a wheelchair, but as a man rising from the ashes of something unspeakable. And he began to see her not just as a caregiver, but as the only person who saw the man behind the pain. Listeners, I invite you to follow Grace deeper into this mansion, into the heartbreak, the healing, and the hope that still flickers even in the darkest of places. Because what happens next? You won't want to miss it. Stay with me. The story has only just begun. Grace had been working at the Whitmore estate for just under 2 weeks, But already she felt the subtle changes in the air, like the house itself was beginning to breathe again. At first, the mansion had seemed almost hostile, a structure too proud to welcome a woman like her. But now the cold silence had softened, ever so slightly. It wasn't warm, not yet, but it no longer felt like it was waiting to spit her out. Each morning began in the quiet before dawn. Grace would arrive in the kitchen, where Carla, still sharp as a whip but with a growing fondness for Grace, handed her a steaming mug of tea without a word. It was a ritual, an unspoken acknowledgement that this job was more than it seemed, that the girl with tired eyes and trembling hands was holding up more than just a schedule. She was holding up a man's entire world, even if he didn't yet know it. Damian Whitmore, for all his wealth and power, was a fortress behind wheels. A man who hid behind silence the way others hid behind doors. At first, Grace assumed it was just pride, the kind of bitterness that comes from having everything and then losing what mattered most. But it didn't take long for her to see the truth behind his carefully measured expressions. He was lonely, terribly, achingly lonely. She saw it in the way he lingered by the windows, watching the world go by as if he were no longer a part of it. She saw it in the way he flinched so subtly, so quickly, when someone brushed past him too closely. She saw it in the way he never asked her about her life, not because he didn't care, but because he was terrified of caring again. And then there were the scars. The first time she noticed them, she had been helping him with his shirt. The sunlight had caught the edge of a jagged, silvery line trailing down his back. A brutal reminder of the accident that had taken his legs and, perhaps more painfully, his faith in people. He didn't speak about it. He didn't have to. Grace had learned to recognize wounds that didn't bleed. But the day she saw the photo album, everything changed. She had been tidying his study when she stumbled upon a box shoved deep behind a stack of books. Inside were photographs, black and white at first, then glossy, colorful ones. Damien standing tall beside a woman with icy blue eyes and a smile too perfect to be real. Evelyn. In the photos, he looked different, softer, open. A man who once laughed without flinching. But something about Evelyn's smile made Grace uneasy. It was too posed, too polished, like a mask she wore for the camera. Before she could close the album, a voice sliced through the silence. "Do you always go through other people's things, Damien?" He was in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I, I didn't mean to pry. I was just... It doesn't matter, he interrupted, wheeling closer. Everyone wants to know. Everyone looks at me and wonders, what happened? What broke him? Grace gently closed the album and placed it back in the box. "You don't owe me your story," she said quietly. "But if you ever want someone to listen, I'll be here." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or sorrow. "That photo," he murmured, his voice lower now, "was taken before the accident, before I realized what people are really like." And then he left the room. That night, Grace lay awake in the small guest room down the hall, staring at the ceiling as memories of his voice swirled in her mind. What had happened to him? What had Evelyn done? She didn't know the answers, but she knew the pain behind his pride ran deep, deeper than his legs not working, deeper than any scar on his back. It was the kind of pain that came from betrayal. And the more Grace saw Evelyn, the more she understood. Evelyn arrived every few days like a storm dressed in silk. She was always elegant, always composed, but her presence poisoned the air. She spoke to Grace in smiles dipped in venom and asked questions with the intent to wound. "So you're the one who bathes him," she said once, her tone a mixture of mockery and disbelief. "Must be so humbling." Grace held her tongue. She'd learned that some battles weren't worth fighting yet. Another time, Evelyn cornered her in the hallway and said with a tilt of her head, "You know, people like you don't usually last long here. Damien likes his world neat and controlled. Eventually, he'll grow tired of your sentimentality." But Grace wasn't just working for Damien. She was fighting for her son, for a life that didn't leave them choosing between dinner or heat, for dignity. And Evelyn's games, while cruel, were nothing compared to the years Grace had spent surviving on scraps of hope. Still, it hurt. It hurt when Evelyn laughed at Lucas's drawing left on the kitchen counter. "A child's scribble? You're bringing crayons into a home built on legacy and enterprise." It hurt when Damien didn't defend her. When he stayed silent in front of Evelyn, even though Grace could see in his eyes that he hated her words. He wasn't ready yet, but she held on to hope that someday he would be. The true breaking point came late one evening, just after a storm had rolled through. Grace was folding towels in the laundry room when she found an envelope shoved under the door. No name, no return address, just one line written in blocky, cruel letters. Leave before it's too late. She stared at it for a long time, her hands trembling. Who would do this? Evelyn came to mind immediately, but there was no proof. When she showed Carla, the housekeeper's face paled. This is getting out of hand, she said. Damien needs to know. No, Grace replied, not yet. I don't want to make it worse. But later that night, while helping Damien settle into bed, he looked at her and asked, Did you get another note? Grace froze. What? Carla told me. She bit her lip, unsure of what to say. Damien's gaze softened, barely, but it did. You shouldn't be the one dealing with this. It's not your fault, she whispered. And I'm not leaving. I need this job. For my son. He looked away. Everyone needs something. Maybe, she said, standing, but some of us are willing to fight for it. As she turned to leave, he said something she hadn't expected. You're stronger than you look. She paused in the doorway, her heart heavy with unspoken truths. So are you, Damien. You just forgot. The next morning, Grace found him in the garden, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair, his gaze distant. I remember when this place felt alive, he said without turning. Now it just feels haunted. Maybe it just needs someone to believe in it again, she said softly. He looked up at her then, really looked. And for the first time, she saw not the man he pretended to be, but the man he was, wounded, weary, but still holding on to something fragile and precious. Hope. It began, as most real changes do, in the quiet moments, not with grand declarations or dramatic turns, but with the slow, subtle shift of a heart learning to beat again. For Grace Holloway, the once invisible, single mother turned caregiver, the days at the Whitmore estate were no longer measured by silence and suspicion, but by the smallest of victories. A glance held a moment longer, a softer tone from Damien, a flicker of something like trust. She never said it aloud, but she felt it. The air in the mansion had changed. Not completely, not yet, but it no longer pressed against her chest like a warning. Instead, it carried the faintest promise of something better. Hope. Damien Whitmore, once untouchable behind his wheelchair and wealth, had stopped barking orders. He didn't smile, not fully, but his voice had lost some of its frost. And though he never said thank you, Grace noticed that he had started waiting for her, listening when she spoke, even watching her as she moved about the room with a quiet presence he no longer found threatening. But it was Lucas, her son, who cracked the stone first. It happened unexpectedly on a gray, wind-whipped morning. Grace had asked Miss Ruth to watch him, as always, but Lucas, ever bold and imaginative, had slipped away. He arrived at the gates of the mansion, holding a rolled-up drawing in his tiny hand, cheeks flushed from the cold and eyes bright with mischief. Carla called Grace in a panic. He's at the front door. Grace's heart dropped. She sprinted through the hall, dread flooding her chest. She wasn't supposed to bring Lucas here. Not yet. Not like this. She rounded the corner just in time to see Damien wheeling into the foyer, his face carved in confusion as he stared at the small boy standing defiantly at his front door. Grace dropped to her knees. Lucas, you can't just run off like that. I missed you, Mommy, he said simply, handing her the drawing. Then turning to Damien, he asked without a hint of fear, Are you the man in the chair? Grace's heart nearly stopped. Lucas, no, that's not polite. But Damien held up a hand. It's fine. He studied the boy with unreadable eyes and then, to Grace's shock, asked, And who are you? I'm Lucas. I drew this for my mom, but I think you'd like it too. And he walked up and handed Damien the drawing. A colorful mess of crayon swirls that somehow captured the mansion, the garden, and a stick figure, Grace holding hands with a man in a wheelchair. It was crude, but it was honest, and somehow it was beautiful. Damien looked down at the paper, expression unreadable. You like to draw? He asked quietly. Yep, I'm going to be an artist when I grow up. Mommy says I'm very creative. Damien nodded slowly. Maybe you are. Grace stood frozen. It was the first time Damien had spoken with someone without that edge in his voice. The first time he had accepted something given without strings. And as Lucas chatted freely, unbothered by the mansion's grandeur or Damien's condition, something in the air shifted. Something broke open. Later, after Lucas was safely returned to Miss Ruth and Grace apologized for the disruption, Damien said something she didn't expect. "You should have brought him sooner." Grace looked up, startled. "He has something," Damien continued almost to himself, "something most people in this house have lost." Grace smiled softly. "He has hope." Damien didn't reply, but he didn't need to. The way he stared at the drawing, now carefully propped on the edge of his bookshelf, spoke volumes. And friends, if your heart is already aching in the best way, if you felt that moment between Damien and Lucas, I ask you, leave a comment below and write, "Hope lives here." Let's flood this space with love for Grace, for her bravery, for her son's bright spirit, because she's carrying the weight of two lives and she's doing it with dignity. In the days that followed, something bloomed between Damien and Grace, not romance, not yet, but understanding, mutual recognition, as if they both saw the wounds the other tried to hide and said, "You're still standing?" "Me too." Damien began to ask questions, small ones, nothing too personal, but curious. He asked about Lucas's favorite color, about how Grace had learned to cook so well with so little, about whether she'd always wanted to be a caregiver. "No," she'd said quietly, "I wanted to be a teacher. But life had other plans." She didn't elaborate, but Damien didn't press. He just nodded. And for once, he looked at her not as an employee, but as a person. One morning, she found him already in the garden. He'd wheeled himself out there before she even arrived. The wind tugged gently at the trees, and sunlight filtered through the high leaves. He sat still, his eyes distant. "You ever just sit and let the world talk to you?" he asked. Grace tilted her head. "Sometimes it's the only voice I hear." He chuckled, low and quiet. "That boy, your son, he said something that stuck with me." "What's that?" "He said I was the man in the chair." Like it was a storybook title. Like there's a beginning, a middle, and maybe an end. Grace smiled. "Maybe he sees the part of your story you haven't reached yet." Damien was silent for a long time, then said something she never imagined he would. "Do you think people like me can change?" She turned to him, eyes soft and sure. "I think people like you are the only ones who do, because you know what it's like to lose and still choose to trim on." It was that day, maybe that very moment, that Damien began to fight again. Not with words, not with stubbornness, but with effort. He asked her to help him back into the physical therapy room. For the first time in months, the room was full of equipment, parallel bars, weights, harnesses, and for Damien, it might as well have been Everest. "I want to try," he said simply. "Just try." Grace stood by him, steady and calm. "I'll be here." The first attempt was brutal. His arms trembled. His breath came fast. His knuckles turned white against the bars, but he didn't stop, and she didn't let him fall. "You're doing it, Damien," she whispered. "You're stronger than you think." When he finally collapsed into the chair again, soaked with sweat, chest heaving, he looked at her with something raw in his eyes. "I didn't think I could," he whispered. "You just did," she replied. And to everyone listening, if you believe in second chances, if you've ever rooted for the underdog, click like now and show Grace you're standing with her. That we see her, that her fight matters. Because her story isn't fiction. It lives in every mother who's done without so her child could eat. In every man who's lost everything and still dared to hope. It lives in you. As Damien made progress in therapy, so too did his trust in Grace deepen. One evening, while she cleaned up after dinner, he rolled into the kitchen, unusual for him, and said something that made her pause mid-step. "I used to think help made me weak." She looked up. "What changed your mind?" He shrugged. "You." She blinked. "Me? You help without taking, without pity. It's rare." Grace didn't know what to say, so she said the truth. "I help because I care. That's not weakness either." Later that night, Damien called her into the study. "Bring him," he said, holding up Lucas's drawing. Grace blinked. "What?" "Bring your son next weekend. Let him see the garden. You were right. It's time." She felt tears spring to her eyes. She nodded. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." "Call me Damien," he said softly. And in that moment, something powerful happened. The man in the chair, the one locked behind silence and pain, opened the door, just a crack. And Grace? She walked through. At first, the notes came quietly, like whispers tucked into the folds of an ordinary day. The first one was slid under the laundry room door, nothing on the envelope, just one sentence scribbled in blocky ink across a torn scrap of paper. Leave before it's too late. Grace stared at it for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest like it was trying to warn her. The words were simple, but their weight fell heavy. Who, she thought, why now? She didn't want to believe what she already suspected, that someone in the house didn't want her there, that someone was watching. She folded the note and tucked it into her apron pocket. She told no one. Not yet. But fear? Fear has a scent. And that night, as she helped Damien prepare for bed, he paused, his sharp eyes watching her more closely than usual. You seem distracted, he said. I'm fine, she replied quickly, but her voice betrayed her. Grace, he said again, slower this time. You're not fine. She tried to deflect. She adjusted the corner of his blanket, smoothed out an invisible crease, but his gaze didn't budge. I found something strange today, she finally admitted, her voice low. A note. It said I should leave. Damien's expression darkened. Where is it? In my pocket. Let me see it. She hesitated, then handed it to him. His jaw tightened as he read the words. This is Evelyn, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Grace's breath caught. You really think so? I know her, he said flatly. She's used to control. She senses it slipping. And this is what she does. She strikes. Quietly, cruelly. Grace took a shaky breath. I don't want to cause trouble. Damien looked at her, his voice sharp but laced with something else. Care. You didn't cause anything. She did. And just like that, the wall between them thinned again. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. Not because of the note, not entirely, but because she'd seen something in Damien's eyes when he read it. Not fear, not and a recognition, like he'd seen this kind of threat before and lost something because of it. The next morning, another note appeared, this time taped to the inside of the garden gate. You don't belong here. Leave while you can. She didn't cry. Not yet. But something inside her twisted. She showed Carla, who stared at the message with pale lips and worried eyes. This isn't a prank, Carla whispered. It's her. It's Evelyn. She wants you gone, and she's getting desperate. Grace nodded, holding the note tight in her fist. I won't be scared away, she said. Not again. And to everyone listening right now, if you've ever been pushed out of a place you were finally beginning to belong, if you've ever fought for a little light in a dark world, drop a comment that says, stay strong, Grace. Let's remind her that she's not alone, that we're standing with her. The pressure only built from there. Evelyn's presence became more hostile, her smiles thinner, her eyes colder. She'd enter rooms and stand too close, make veiled comments in front of Damien. Caregivers come and go, she said one morning at breakfast, sipping her coffee like it tasted sweeter than her words. Some of them think they matter, but they always leave. Damien didn't respond. He didn't look at either of them. But Grace saw the muscles in his jaw twitch, and she knew he was listening. She tried to avoid Evelyn, tried to keep her distance. But one afternoon as she passed the study, Evelyn stepped out from the shadows like she'd been waiting. You really don't know what you're dealing with, she said, voice low and sharp. He's not some broken man for you to fix. He's mine. Grace stared at her. He's not an object. He's a person. Evelyn's laugh was bitter. You think this is about him? It's about control, and I've had it for a long, long time. That night, Grace found Damien sitting alone in the library, a book open in his lap, unread. His eyes were fixed on the fire. Did you love her? She asked softly. He didn't answer right away. I trusted her, he said, finally, which for me is far more dangerous than love. Grace sat beside him. She's afraid. Afraid, she said. She should be. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly. Then Damien said something that Grace had never heard from him before. Not in words. The accident, it wasn't what destroyed me. She turned, eyes searching his face. It was the people who were still standing when I fell, he said. The ones who stayed to watch and the ones who walked away. He didn't have to say names. She knew Evelyn was one of them. And dear listener, if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, someone who should have caught you but instead let you fall, please write "I understand" in the comments. Because Damien's pain, it's not just his. It belongs to all of us who have tasted that bitterness. In the days that followed, Damien began to open up more. He told Grace about the accident, a fall from a horse during a charity event just outside the city. He'd been an avid rider, proud and competitive. It was a freak moment. One misstep, one wrong angle, and everything changed. He woke up in the hospital, unable to feel his legs. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part, he said, voice trembling for the first time, was looking up and seeing Evelyn standing there, smiling. Grace covered her mouth. She said the right things. Touched my hand. Promised to take care of everything. And then she started changing the locks, rewriting the business documents, quietly shifting power. I was too proud to stop her, too angry at myself. He looked up at her, eyes raw. She made me feel like I was a burden, like being broken meant I didn't deserve to be heard. Grace's voice was gentle. You're not broken, Damien. You're just healing. That takes time. He looked at her like she was the first person who'd ever told him that. But Evelyn wasn't done. One afternoon, Grace entered the kitchen to find an envelope waiting on the counter. No name. Inside was another note, this one colder, crueler. You're digging your own grave. Leave before it's too late. She froze. Carla came in and saw the note. Her face fell. That's enough. You're going to Damien, tonight. Grace nodded. That evening, she found him in the garden, the sun just beginning to set behind the tall hedges. He was sitting quietly watching the sky. I need to tell you something, she said, walking over. He turned. She held out the note. He read it in silence, then looked up at her. She's threatening you now? Grace's throat tightened. I didn't want to cause trouble. You didn't, he said firmly. She did, and I'm going to stop it. How? Grace whispered. Damien looked her dead in the eyes, by taking back everything she stole from me. That night marked a turning point. The next morning, Damien met with his legal team, quietly, carefully. And with Grace's help, he began reviewing documents, papers Evelyn had slipped past him when he was too broken to fight. And she knew it, because 2 days later, Evelyn stormed into the library and confronted Grace, venom dripping from her voice. You think you've won? She hissed. He's only pretending to trust you. He doesn't need you. He'll toss you aside like all the rest. But Grace didn't flinch. Not anymore. I'm not here to win anything, she said calmly. I'm here because he matters. And because no one deserves to be manipulated the way you've manipulated him. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. Just stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Later that evening, Damien took Grace aside. I want you to know something, he said. You've reminded me what it feels like to trust again. And I won't let her take that from me. Grace's eyes filled. You're not alone anymore, Damien. It was in the quiet moments, those early hours just before the world stirred awake, that Grace often found Damien sitting in the garden, eyes cast toward the sky, watching the wind move through the trees as though it carried answers he was too tired to ask for. The once intimidating man who had met her with cold eyes and clipped tones was beginning to change, but not with speed or fanfare. No, Damien Whitmore was changing the way winter fades, slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably, as light began to find its way into the dark corners he'd locked shut. And Grace, with her steady presence and open heart, was the quiet warmth coaxing the thaw. The physical therapy room had sat untouched for months. Dust had gathered on the parallel bars, and cobwebs clung to the high windows where sunlight no longer danced. It was a room built for effort, for resilience, but it had been left in silence after the accident. Until now. I want to try, Damien said one morning, his voice low but certain. Grace blinked. Try? He nodded once. Standing. She felt her breath catch, not because she doubted him, but because he hadn't said those words before, not to her, not to anyone. It was the first time she saw not just the man in the chair, but the fighter buried beneath the pain, and it made her heart ache in the most beautiful way. She didn't hesitate. Then let's try. The room smelled of wood polish and time. Grace wiped down the equipment while Damien wheeled himself to the center, his movements steady but tense. His eyes scanned the space like a soldier revisiting a battlefield. She could see it on his face, that fear that lived just beneath the surface, the kind that said, "What if I fall? What if I fail again?" Grace stepped beside him, her hands gentle but firm. "We're not here to impress anyone," she whispered. "Only to prove to yourself that you're still moving forward." Damien positioned himself beside the bars, his hands gripping them tightly. His arms trembled slightly, and for a long moment nothing happened. He didn't speak, he didn't breathe. And then, with a sharp inhale, he lifted. Not far, not for long, but his body left the seat, and in that moment, time froze. "I felt it," he whispered, chest heaving. "I felt it." Whoop! Grace swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "You did, Damien. You're doing it." He sank back into the chair, sweat beading on his forehead. But his eyes, oh, his eyes, were bright. They sparkled with something she hadn't seen before. Hope. From that day forward, the therapy room was no longer forgotten. Damien insisted on visiting it every morning. Some days he stood longer, some days he couldn't at all. But every time he tried. And Grace was always beside him, patient, calm, never pushing too hard but never letting him stop short either. "You're building strength," she told him once, adjusting his arms. "Not just here," she said, tapping his biceps, "but here," and gently rested her hand over his heart. He looked at her for a long time and said, "I thought strength meant never needing anyone." "It doesn't," she replied. "It means knowing when to lean and choosing to stand anyway." It was in those quiet exchanges that something else began to bloom between them. It wasn't romance, at least not yet. It was deeper, recognition. Two people who had spent too long caring too much finally finding someone who saw beyond the surface. And perhaps for Damien, that was the hardest part, being seen without judgment. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session, Grace helped Damien back into his chair, his breath shallow, his face flushed with effort. "You're surpassing yourself, Damien," she said with a smile, handing him a towel. He chuckled softly. "With a good drill sergeant like you, how could I not?" She laughed, and it was the kind of sound that made the air feel lighter. For a moment, he didn't look like a man haunted by the past. He looked like a man living in the present. But not everyone in the mansion was pleased with this transformation. Evelyn's visits had grown more infrequent, but when she came, the tension thickened like fog. She noticed the change in Damien, his posture, his tone, the way he deferred to Grace in small moments. And she hated it. "You're filling his head with fantasies," she said one morning, cornering Grace near the therapy room. "You think you're helping him, but all you're doing is reminding him of what he's lost." Grace met her gaze evenly. "No, I'm reminding him of what he still has." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "You don't belong in his world." Grace's voice was calm but firm. Then maybe his world needed to change. Later that evening, Damien found her in the garden, her hands curled around a mug of tea, eyes distant. "She said something to you, didn't she?" Grace didn't answer right away. "She's afraid," she said at last, "of losing what she never truly valued." Damien was quiet, then he said, "I'm tired of living in her shadow, and I'm tired of hiding behind mine." The next day, he pushed himself harder than ever before. 3 full lifts, 10 seconds standing. And when he lowered himself back into the chair, his eyes shone with something raw and vulnerable. "I want to walk again," he said. "I will walk again." Grace nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "And I'll be right here, every step of the way." And friends, if your heart is swelling right now, if you've ever felt that moment where belief takes root in a person who thought they were beyond repair, drop a comment that says, "Keep going, Damien." Let's let him know that he's not alone, that his fight is our fight too. In the days that followed, Lucas visited again, this time with permission. He ran through the gardens with laughter in his lungs, his crayons tucked under one arm, and his eyes full of wonder. He saw Damien in the therapy room and watched quietly from the doorway as Grace supported him through another attempt. "You're doing great," Lucas said softly. Damien looked over, surprised. "Thanks, kid." Lucas grinned. "Next time I come, I bet you'll be walking." Damien smiled, a real smile. "Maybe I will." Afterward, as they sat in the garden watching Lucas draw, Damien turned to Grace. Your son sees the world as it should be, not as it is. Grace nodded. Because I've always told him to look for the light, even when it's hard to see. Damien reached out and gently took the drawing Lucas had made. In it, three figures stood side by side, Grace, Lucas, and Damien. And Damien wasn't in the chair. He was standing. I used to believe standing again was impossible, Damien said quietly. Now, I think maybe it's just waiting for me. Grace looked at it on phone, her voice barely a whisper. And you're almost there. It was quiet the morning Damien called Grace into the study, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. No, this silence had weight to it, a stillness that hummed just beneath the surface like the air before a storm. The morning sun spilled through the tall windows, painting golden stripes across the polished floors. But even that light couldn't shake the feeling in Grace's chest. She knew something was coming, something big. Damien had been withdrawn all weekend, distracted by papers spread across his desk, documents that bore Evelyn's name in thick, arrogant print. His lips pressed into a line, his hands steady but colder. For the first time in weeks, he had distanced himself from Grace, not cruelly but purposefully, as though trying to protect her from what he already saw unraveling. Now, as she stepped into the study, she saw it in his eyes. Not hesitation, not fear, but resolve. I have something to show you, Damien said quietly, gesturing to the folder in front of him. He didn't look up. Grace stepped closer, hands clasped in front of her, heart racing. These are financial statements, property contracts, investment reports. His fingers tapped the pages, all altered. Her breath caught. She's been shifting assets under my name, redirecting money into accounts I didn't authorize. It's been going on for years, Grace, years. She stared at him, struggling to find words. How did you find out? His lips lifted in a bitter, tired smile. Because you asked questions I never thought to ask. He looked up then, and his eyes were more open than she'd ever seen them. Tired, yes, but not defeated. You helped me see again, he said. Not just what she's done, but what I let happen. Grace stepped forward, her voice low. It's not your fault, Damien. I let her control everything, he continued. Because I thought losing my legs meant losing my worth. Because I thought no one would take me seriously again. She knew that, and she used it. A long pause stretched between them. Then Damien looked her straight in the eye. But that ends today. He had already summoned Evelyn. Grace's breath hitched. Are you sure you want me here for this? Yes, he said without blinking, because she'll try to twist it. And I need you to remind me of the truth. And dear listener, if your heart is pounding with Grace's, if you've ever stood on the edge of a moment where truth meets justice, I ask you, comment. Stand strong. Let Grace know she isn't alone. Let Damien know the time for silence is over. When Evelyn entered, she was as flawless as ever. Her heels clicked like a metronome across the hardwood floor. Her coat, tailored and rich, hung over her arm like a royal cape, and her expression was sharp with the kind of confidence that only comes from years of getting away with everything. Damien, she said smoothly, as if nothing had changed, you asked to see me? He didn't offer her a seat. He didn't smile. He simply lifted the folder and handed it to her. She blinked, then slowly opened it. Her eyes scanned the pages. Her fingers stopped. And in that tiny hesitation, just a flicker of a pause, Grace saw it. Guilt. What is this? Evelyn asked, her voice tight. Damien's voice was quiet but strong. It's proof of what you've been doing behind my back. Proof that you've been siphoning money, rewriting the estate. Evelyn let out a soft laugh, but it was brittle around the edges. This is absurd. Damien, you've always had me manage your accounts. You asked me to. I trusted you, he said, voice sharp now. That's different. Evelyn's eyes flickered to Grace, standing quietly by the window. Her jaw tightened. This is her doing, isn't it? She hissed. She put these ideas in your head. She's poisoning you against me. Damien didn't flinch. She's reminding me of who I used to be. Someone who could think clearly. Someone who didn't hide behind pain and let someone else run his life. Evelyn's voice cracked, just a little. After everything I've done for you, what you've done, he interrupted, is steal from me, manipulate me, make me feel small when I was already broken. And I let you, but not anymore. There it was, The truth. Clear, undeniable. And Evelyn? She stood frozen for a moment, realizing for the first time that she had truly lost. "You'll regret this," she whispered. "No," Damien said calmly. "I regret letting it go on this long." She turned and walked out without another word. And as the door closed behind her, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was clean, fresh, like the first breath after a storm. Damien leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. For a moment, he looked older, but also lighter. Grace stepped forward, kneeling beside him. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm free." They didn't speak again for a while. They didn't have to. That evening, the air in the mansion felt different. Carla even smiled as she passed Grace in the hall, whispering, "It's over. She's gone." But Grace knew that healing doesn't begin the moment the pain leaves. It begins the moment you stop blaming yourself for letting it in. The next morning, Damien asked to go back to the therapy room. When they arrived, he wheeled himself to the parallel bars. This time, he didn't wait for Grace to speak. He didn't hesitate. He gripped the bars, breathed in deep, and pulled himself up. This time, he stood for 15 full seconds. Grace wiped at her eyes, watching him. "You're standing taller already," she said. Damien looked at her and for the first time said something he'd never said before. "Thank you." "Anytime," she replied, voice shaking. "And Grace?" "Yes?" "Don't leave," she smiled. "I never planned to." So to those still listening, if you've ever watched someone reclaim their strength, if you've ever found your voice after being silenced, right, you are not broken. Let Grace feel your support. Let Damien feel your pride. Let's remind them and ourselves that healing is not weakness, it is courage. And as the days passed, Damien continued to rise, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The estate slowly transformed. Flowers bloomed again in the garden. The halls no longer echoed with secrets, but with laughter. Lucas's laughter especially, who now visited more often than not, his drawings proudly taped across kitchen cabinets and hallway doors. And one afternoon, as Damien sat on the patio beside Grace, sipping tea under the golden light of a setting sun, he reached for her hand. Not quickly, not with urgency, but with intention. "This place was once a prison," he said, "but now it feels like home again." Grace turned to him, her ways soft as the breeze. "That's because you took it back." He smiled. "No, you helped me find it again." And in that moment, neither of them were lost, not anymore. It began with one step, not a large step, not a dramatic one, but one single, trembling movement of a leg that had long been silent. The room had been quiet, filled with nothing but the sound of Grace's soft voice urging, "You've got this," and the slight creak of Damien's grip tightening on the parallel bars. He was drenched in sweat, his arms shaking, his jaw clenched. But that step was everything. The moment his foot touched forward and held, however briefly, Grace felt the world shift beneath her. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands came to her mouth. Her heart pounded with awe and disbelief. "You did it," she whispered. Damien slowly, painfully, lowered himself back into the wheelchair. His eyes were wide, not with shock but with something deeper. Pride, gratitude. A flicker of the man he'd once been, now fused with the man he was becoming. His chest heaved, but his lips lifted into the faintest of smiles. "I did," he said almost to himself. "I did." Tears slipped down Grace's cheeks, not out of sadness, but from the kind of joy that only arrives after long, long seasons of waiting. From the kind of victory that doesn't just change a day, it changes a life. They sat in silence for a long time after, letting the moment sink into their bones. Outside, the world carried on as usual. But inside that room, inside that house that had once been choked with grief and silence, something sacred had just been reborn. Damien took more steps in the days that followed. One step became two, two became four. Each time, Grace stood at his side, not pushing, not pulling, but anchoring him in the quiet strength only love can give. He still used the chair. Of course he did. Healing wasn't linear. But now, every time his wheels touched the floor, it wasn't because he had to, but because he was choosing to. Because he now believed he could do more. And something else had changed too, his laughter. It started showing up again, awkward at first, like it had forgotten how to rise from his chest. But when Lucas visited and made a joke about how the man in the chair was starting to become the man who walks a little, Damien laughed so hard he actually had to catch his breath. Grace watched him with wonder. She hadn't fallen in love with him. Not at first. What she had fallen in love with was his strength, his fight, his silent way of holding pain without demanding pity. But now she was beginning to see a version of Damien who wasn't just surviving. He was living. One morning, as the house filled with the warm aroma of baking bread, thanks to Lucas's newfound obsession with cooking, Grace entered the study to find Damien seated at his desk, a small stack of papers in front of him. His posture was straighter, his expression calm. "I have something for you," he said. She furrowed her brow and stepped closer. He handed her the first sheet. It was a formal employment contract, professional and polished, with her name at the top in bold. But the numbers at the bottom made her knees come. "Damien, this is too much." "It's what you're worth," he said simply. "You've earned it." Her throat tightened. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes," he said softer now. "I did." She stared at the paper, then at him. "Thank you." But he wasn't finished. "There's something else." He opened a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't speak. He didn't get down on one knee. His legs weren't ready for that yet. But the way he looked at her said everything. Grace froze, her breath caught in her chest. Damien opened the box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring. No diamonds, no extravagance. Just a gold band engraved with 3 small words. "Still standing, together." "I don't know what to call what we have," Damien began. "It's not just love. It's something deeper. You've walked with me through fire, Grace. You never gave up on me. Not once. I want to spend the rest of my life walking towards something with you. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes instantly. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Damien. 1,000 times, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling. And for the first time in years, maybe ever, he cried. Not the kind of tears born from frustration or loss, but from release, from gratitude, from being seen and loved, not despite his pain, but through it. And dear listener, if this moment stirred something inside you, if you've ever believed in second chances, in redemption, in love that heals and doesn't hurt, write "still standing" together in the comments. Let's celebrate Grace's quiet strength and Damien's brave heart. Let's honor the steps it took to reach this beautiful breaking open place. The house was filled with light now. Lucas ran through the garden more often than not, trailing laughter behind him like a comet's tail. His drawings now lined the hallway. A crooked sun, 3 smiling stick figures, and one beautiful message scrawled in bold crayon. "My family." Grace framed that one and placed it by the front door. The staff smiled more. Carla, once stoic and serious, now cracked jokes in the kitchen. Even the walls, yes, even they seemed to breathe differently. The weight that once clung to the air like fog had lifted. The mansion wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home. And when Damien finally took his first unaided step down the hall toward Grace, no bars, no chair, Lucas clapped his hands so hard he nearly fell over himself. "Mommy, he did it. He really did it." Damien steadied himself and grinned. "We did it." Grace nodded through her tears. "Yes, we did." Their wedding was simple, intimate. The garden Damien once avoided like a graveyard had been transformed into something magical. White chairs lined the pathway. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze. Lucas stood between them, the proudest ring bearer in history, and Carla cried behind her sunglasses, pretending it was just the sunlight. Damien, in a tailored suit and with a single black cane, stood on his own 2 feet when Grace walked toward him, her dress simple, her smile radiant. And when he spoke his vows, his voice shook, but never broke. "You found me when I didn't want to be found. You loved me when I didn't think I was lovable. You helped me remember who I was and believe in who I could be. Grace, with you, I am not a man in a chair. I am a man with a future." Grace's voice trembled with emotion as she replied, "You gave me safety when all I knew was survival. You gave my son a father when he only had dreams. And you gave me hope when I didn't even know I still needed it. Damien, with you, I have a home." They kissed beneath the golden canopy of late afternoon sun, and the applause that followed wasn't loud. It was warm, the kind of sound that fills every inch of your soul and whispers, "You're exactly where you're meant to be." Later that night, Lucas climbed into bed between them in the big master suite and said, "This is the best day of my life." Damien looked at Grace. Grace looked at him, and they knew this was only the beginning. The morning after the wedding, the mansion woke not with silence, but with laughter. Soft footsteps pattered across polished floors. Lucas's excited voice bounced off the walls, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen as sunlight poured through windows that had once remained shut. The house that was once a prison of quiet regrets now hummed with life, a symphony of second chances and the steady rhythm of hearts learning how to love again. Grace stood barefoot in the garden, her wedding ring glinting softly as she breathed in the crisp air, the hem of her robe swaying gently in the breeze. Damien came up behind her slowly, leaning on his cane, but steady, proud, and free in a way he never believed he'd be again. She turned when she heard him. "Morning, Mr. Whitmore," she teased. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he replied, smiling in that quiet, unpolished way that only she got to see now. They stood in silence for a moment, simply being, and that was enough. After everything, the pain, the years of loneliness, the anger, the fear, the long nights and whispered prayers, just being was the most extraordinary thing in the world. Lucas ran out a few minutes later, arms full of drawing paper and colored pencils. "I want to draw our family today," he declared, plopping down in the grass. Damien looked at Grace. "He's got a gift." "He's got a heart," she replied, her eyes soft, "big enough to fit all of us." And isn't that the truth? Sometimes the greatest healing doesn't come from miracles or money or medicine. Sometimes it comes from a child's laugh, a steady hand, and someone who refuses to walk away, even when it's hard. Grace never needed riches. Damien never needed saving. What they needed was each other. In the following weeks, the mansion transformed, not in the ways most people expect. There were no remodels, no expensive renovations, but the change was real, deep, unmistakable. Lucas's drawings were framed and hung in the hallways right next to antique paintings. Grace's humming while she cleaned filled the rooms with a quiet joy that soaked into the wood and the wallpaper. Even Carla, the ever-reserved housekeeper, was caught dancing in the kitchen one afternoon when she thought no one was watching. And Damien? He was walking more. Not far, not fast, but each step was a defiant message to the past. You didn't win. One day, Grace asked him what changed most since she came into his life. He paused, then said, "Before you, I existed. With you, I'm living." That evening, they hosted a small celebration in the garden. Nothing fancy, just friends, laughter, and warm food. Lucas ran around barefoot, his hands sticky with cake, giggling as Carla chased him with a napkin. Damien gave a toast, leaning lightly on his cane. "I used to believe this house would be my last stop," he said, his voice steady. "I built it to impress people I no longer speak to, filled it with things that never made me feel full." Then Grace walked in, with her hands calloused, her voice soft, and her son with eyes full of hope. And they turned this place into a home, into our home. Grace's eyes glistened with tears. "I don't know what I did to deserve this second chance," Damien continued, "but I do know that I won't waste it." And friend, as you listen now, maybe in your car, maybe at home, maybe as you close your eyes and let the day wash over you, remember this: it's never too late, not to heal, not to love, not to start again. Life doesn't always unfold the way we imagine. Sometimes it breaks us, sometimes it takes us to our knees. But sometimes, if we're lucky, it brings someone into our lives who sees us, not as we are, but as we could be. And that changes everything. Grace Holloway didn't walk into the mansion to find love. She walked in because she had no choice, because her son needed a future, and the world hadn't given her many options. But what she found was something more valuable than comfort. She found purpose. She found a man who had lost everything but still had the capacity to grow. She found a reason to believe that even the most wounded hearts can beat again. And Damian Whitmore, he didn't need a caregiver. He needed someone to care. Someone to look past his bitterness and see the broken boy still sitting quietly inside the man. Someone to hand him a mirror and say, "You're still here, you still matter." So if this story moved you, and I know it did, do something with that feeling. Comment "You matter" below for all the Graces and all the Damians out there. For anyone listening who's ever wondered if it's too late to find joy again. For anyone who's ever looked at their own reflection and questioned whether they were still worth loving. And if you believe in the power of stories that remind us of our strength, of our resilience, of the beauty and simple human connection, like this video right now. Because Grace and Damian's story may be fictional, but their journey, their fight, their victory, that lives in all of us. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because here we tell stories that lift the human spirit. Stories that carry you through the darkness and walk with you into the light. Stories like Grace's, stories like Damian's, stories like yours. And remember this, you don't have to have it all together to be worthy of love. You don't have to be perfect to change someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is showing up, holding on, and believing in one small, quiet step forward. So as we close this chapter, take a deep breath. Let Grace's journey remind you that healing is messy, but worth it. That love may not come in the way you expect, but it comes. That a mansion without laughter is just a building, but a tiny kitchen filled with joy, that's a kingdom. Let Damian's steps remind you that courage isn't always loud. It's often quiet, painful, and persistent. That standing up, physically or emotionally, isn't about strength alone, but about the people beside you who whisper, "I've got you." Let Lucas's giggles remind you that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from those who haven't been taught to doubt themselves yet. That children see light in places adults have long forgotten. And let Grace's hand in Damian's tell you that love is not just about fireworks and fairy tales. It's about choosing someone every day. It's about forgiveness, about compassion, about staying, even when it's hard. This story started in darkness, with bills piling up, a mother with no way out, and a man trapped in silence. But it ends here, with music in the garden, sunlight on their faces, a little boy drawing stick figures under a tree, and two souls who thought they were broken, standing, still standing together. From all of us here, thank you for listening. Please comment below. Tell us what this story meant to you. Tell us which moment moved you the most. And if you know someone who needs this reminder that love can heal, that joy is still possible, share this story with them. Because when we share hope, we keep it alive. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and keep your heart open. We'll be waiting here with the next story.